Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak to our Conservative motion that, among other things, calls on the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, to testify about Beijing's election interference in 2019 and 2021. After all, Katie Telford, as the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, is a critical witness to get to the heart of this scandal, namely, what does the Prime Minister know, when did he learn about it, and what did he do or fail to do about Beijing's election interference? While this motion is a test for this government, it is also a test for the NDP, because on 3 occasions, the NDP at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee blocked Katie Telford from appearing before the committee.
Shame.
And so the NDP has a choice. They can continue to do the bidding for this corrupt Liberal government, propping up this corrupt Prime Minister, or they can work with us to protect the sanctity of the ballot box and the integrity of our elections by working to get the answers that Canadians deserve about Beijing's election interference in not 1 but 2 federal elections. We'll soon find out what choice they make. Madam Speaker, the key question that must be asked is, what does the Prime Minister have to hide? Since November, when reports of Beijing's interference in the 2019 and 21 elections came to light, the Prime Minister has refused to come clean about what he knows. For 2 weeks, the Prime Minister was silent. Then the Prime Minister broke his silence in an effort to sow confusion and avoid accountability. The Prime Minister used carefully chosen words to say that he was not briefed about candidates receiving money from China. How convenient, because no one was ever saying that candidates received money from China. It's not as if Beijing writes checks and hands them out to candidates. It's an absurdity, Madam Speaker. What is at issue is a campaign of interference by Beijing in 2 federal elections. And on that issue, the Prime Minister has refused to answer the most basic of questions. He's refused to say how many times he was briefed. He's even refused to acknowledge that he had been briefed, even though it is now well established that the Prime Minister had been frequently briefed about Beijing's election interference. Indeed, the Prime Minister's own National Security Advisor, when she testified at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, acknowledged that the Prime Minister had been briefed frequently. In a desperate attempt to change the channel, the Prime Minister has engaged in pathetic attacks, including even going so far as to outrageously claim that those who want to get to the bottom of Beijing's interference, those who would dare to hold this Prime Minister to account for Beijing's attack on our democracy, are undermining democracy.
Shame.
Madam Speaker, it is Beijing interfering in 2 federal elections that is undermining democracy, and it is a Prime Minister who has turned a blind eye to interference who is undermining democracy.
That's right.
Madam Speaker, the Prime Minister has shut down calls for an independent public inquiry. He has ordered Liberal MPs on the Procedure and House Affairs Committee to use every trick in the book to impede the work of that committee to get to the bottom of Beijing's interference, including blocking the production of relevant documents, shielding key PMO officials and former ministers and current ministers, now culminating in a shameful filibuster that has gone on for 4 days and nearly 24 hours to shield the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff from having to come to committee. Shameful. Madam Speaker, taken together, the actions of the Prime Minister are not the actions of a transparent Prime Minister. They're not the actions of a Prime Minister who is concerned about Beijing's election interference. They are the actions of a Prime Minister who has something to hide. They are the actions of a Prime Minister who is engaged in a cover-up. Madam Speaker, Beijing's interference in the 2019 and 21 elections is not speculative. It is well documented. Even in the limited disclosure to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, that interference is evident. For example, a February 21st, 2020 daily intelligence brief prepared by the PCO observed that Beijing orchestrated, quote, subtle but effective interference networks in the 2019 election, end of quote. Subtle but effective interference networks. And the Prime Minister received that PCO briefing, according to his National Security Advisor. During the 2021 election, a September 13, 2021 open data analysis of the Rapid Response Mechanism of Global Affairs Canada observed an online disinformation campaign on online social media sites of those affiliated with the Beijing regime, targeting the Conservative Party generally, and also targeting individual Conservative candidates, including then Conservative Member of Parliament, now defeated Conservative Member of Parliament, Kenny Chiu. And that open data analysis further observed that that disinformation campaign had, quote, grown in considerable scale, end of quote. And then there are the reports from the Globe and Mail and Global News based upon their review of CSIS and other security and intelligence documents that reveal a campaign of interference by Beijing. It begs the question, in the face of that interference, what did the Prime Minister do about it? It appears that he did nothing about it. After all, no arrests have been made, no diplomats have been expelled, and the Prime Minister kept Canadians in the dark. And Canadians would still be kept in the dark but for whistleblowers and the work of Global News and the Globe and Mail. CSIS advised the Prime Minister that in response to foreign interference, the policy of the government should be one of transparency and sunlight, and that such interference should be made known to the public. The Prime Minister has done the opposite of this. He kept Canadians in the dark, and now he is trying to bury the truth with a smokescreen, including a so-called special rapporteur who he appoints, who reports to him, who turns out to be a family friend and is a member of the Beijing-funded Trudeau Foundation, someone who is hardly independent, and a secret committee with secret evidence and secret conclusions redacted by the PMO. Hardly transparency and sunlight. And so, Madam Speaker, it is why we've put forward this motion, because Canadians deserve transparency and sunlight. It's time to end Liberal obstruction. It's time to end the Liberal cover-up. It's time to get answers, and that starts with hearing from the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. If the Prime Minister really had nothing to hide, he would support transparency and sunlight. He would support this motion. Thank you, Madam
Questions and comments. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader, Senate. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I've asked this member this question in the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and I've encouraged him to address it on a number of occasions, and he hasn't. So I'll ask the question very clear to him today. The member from Red Deer Lacombe referred to a sitting member of this House as an agent of Beijing. Does this member think that any MP that currently sits in this House is an agent of Beijing?
The Honourable Member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, what I would encourage this House to do is vote for this motion to end the Liberal cover-up.
Absolutely. Questions and commentaires? Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Stratcombe.
Madam Speaker, this is my first time standing in the House this week, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the two fallen police officers that lost their lives last week in Edmonton, Constable Ryan and Constable Jordan. And I wanted to just acknowledge the service that they did and the ultimate price they paid, and to give my deepest sympathies to the family and loved ones of both of those constables. Madam Speaker, I guess for this member, I'd like to ask him a quick question. You know, in Proc, there was a motion brought forward by the NDP to expand the scope of the study to ensure that we were looking at not just Chinese interference, but looking at interference by Iran, by Russia, by other countries who we know have influenced or have tried to influence previous elections. This member voted against that. I'm wondering if now he would say that it is important for us to look not just at the 2021 and the 2019 elections, but to look at all of our election processes and look at other countries and their attempts to influence our electoral processes.
Member for St. Albert Edmonton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would first of all associate myself with the comments from the member for Edmonton Strathcona regarding the horrific killing of two brave Edmonton police constables, Constables Jordan and Ryan. And my thoughts and prayers are with their families and the entire Edmonton Police Service. It illustrates that men and women in law enforcement do every single day put their lives on the line, and Constables Ryan and Jordan did just that, and they will always be remembered for their service to protect our community in Edmonton. And Madam Speaker, I also would acknowledge that foreign interference from Russia, from Iran, and other countries, other bad actors, is a real problem. But we have very specific reports, a very specific interference into very specific federal elections. And we need to get to the bottom of these issues, and the way to do that is to have a focused study at a parliamentary committee that can call witnesses to get those answers that Canadians deserve, and it also includes a full and independent public inquiry, not the smokescreen that the Prime Minister has offered to cover up the truth.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Pierre Boucher, Les Patriotes Verchères. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. He has used a different narrative that I might have, but the substance of his speech is something we agree with and is valid. But what I would like to have heard him on, because he denounced the NDP, he denounced the Liberal government with regard to their coalition, the fact that there is still not a public inquiry that's been announced. But I'd like to know, what does he think could justify on the part of the government, the NDP, would they refuse something that the entire Canadian population is calling for?
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it's very disappointing that the NDP has stood in the way of getting answers. This is an NDP government, NDP opposition party that might as well be called the NDP government, joined at the hip with this Liberal government. They propped up this Prime Minister at every step of the way. And so this motion puts them to the test. They'll have to stand up one by one by one and vote either to prop up this corrupt Prime Minister or get to the bottom of Beijing's election interference. The choice is theirs. There's only one choice that is the right one, and that's to vote for the motion. Thank you, Madam Chair.